Page 123, September of 1853. Dear Austin, I found the auction bill, and so I'm writing you a letter on the back. Jupiter was about to be sold off, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. He's not a buck! He's a boy! I shouted at the auctioneer. He's a boy, and he's got a name. His name is Jupiter Hale. I felt my heart pounding against my chest as everyone turned to stare at me. Well, thank you, son, for the powerful piece of information. The auctioneer flashed a smile, but I could see his angry boiling behind his grin. Truth is, this ain't no church social, so if you ain't biddin', you best keep quiet. Least you get mixed up with those that are. They don't want to know him. I thought they don't want to know him. I thought as two men beside me stepped forward to get a closer look. They don't want to know him at all. He's Jupiter, I wanted to shout at them. He can talk without words. He's got a dog called Whistle and a sister named Darcy. He can dive off Widow's Rock and Witter better than anyone I know. He's afraid of snakes, but he's braver enough to walk through a swamp full of them and gators too. But I didn't say any of those things. Instead, I just stood there, silent and helpless, as the auctioneer started the bidding again. My eyes shot back to Jupiter, whose forehead was beading with sweat. His eyes were big and glassy with fear, and he was trembling badly. If only we had stayed home, Jupe, I thought. If only we had stayed home. But we are long away from Sudbury. He was standing up there all alone, just as he had done at Widow's Rock. Only this was worse, much worse, because this wasn't going to end with one dive. This could go on and on for the rest of his life. I remembered Possum's brother telling us about the slaves sold to the cotton fields and how badly they were treated, how their entire lives were used up and spent under the lash of an overseer's bullwhip. I shredded at the thought of Jupiter's life taken away from him like that. A man beside me called out, $300! A voice in the back of the crowd called out, Four! I have four. Do I hear five? The auctioneer shouted. Jupiter bit down on his lip as the overseer tugged on the rope. That bound of his hands, I felt a fit of hiccups coming on, but I shook them off. Jupiter was doing his best to stay strong, and I had to do the same. Four going once, going twice. My eyes filled with tears so that I couldn't see. Be still, my heart, a voice suddenly sang from the back of the crowd. I'll give you $500. Sold, the auctioneer declared, lowering his gavel on the wooden podium in front of him. I climbed back up on the edge of the water through and was able to see the crowd parting as men tried to steer clear of the latest buyer. A buyer wearing a corn shuck hat and carrying a powerful stink on him. Fergus? I cried, jumping off the trough. For it was Fergus T. McGrath himself, who was bid on and bought Jupiter for $500. And you know, Austin, I didn't care how bad he smelled. He was the sweetest sight I had ever laid eyes on, and I told him so. We made our way up to the platform to free Jupiter, and while I used my knife to cut the ropes around his wrists, Fergus dealt with the auctioneer, who would not let go of Darcy's walking stick. I think the stink on Ferguson was so strong that the auctioneer finally gave it up in desperation just to be rid of him. Just then a strong black hand reached out for Jupiter, and I looked up to see Winston standing before us. Preacher Tully was at his side. That's when we discovered that it wasn't Ferguson who put up money to buy Jupiter, but rather Winston and Preacher Tully. The preacher explained it all. He told us how he and Winston had come down looking for us. They had made all their way into the state of North Carolina when the axle on the preacher's wagon broke. A short spell later, Ferguson stopped by to offer his help. The axle was beyond anything they could repair, so Ferguson offered to give Winston and Preacher Tully a lift to the nearest town. It wasn't until they had gotten into the back of the wagon that Winston recognized my old turnip head sticking out from behind the crate of chickens. When the preacher questioned Fergus, he told them he told them of our meeting and where he thought we might be headed. Winston and the preacher begged him to take them to the auction, and he agreed on the condition that they buy the chickens, pigs, and ducks he had meant to sell. Winston held on to Jupiter now as if they would never let him go. We were laughing and crying and so relieved to see one another. Only when Winston asked about Darcy did we all quiet down. I told him we hadn't seen or heard of her, and he sighed so heavy I had to look away. After Preacher and Winston had searched the yard once more, we left in Fergus's wagon. This was no place for Winston or Jupiter to linger. Riding away from that auction yard was like riding away from a funeral. For me, I knew that riding north meant that we were riding away from any chance of finding Darcy. Jupiter closed his eyes as soon as we got into the wagon. He didn't open them once till we were a mile or more away. I don't ever want to see or hear or smell like the likes of that evil place again. I knew Jupiter must feel the same, but I don't imagine he could ever forget it. The lash marks on his legs aren't likely to let him. Your brother, Levi, heading home.